There is a moment, somewhere between the rhythm of the pedals and the blur of the tree line, when a cyclist stops thinking about the road ahead and starts to feel, truly feel, the world closing in around them. The air changes first, then the silence. Not the comfortable silence of an empty trail on a Sunday morning, but something older, something that has teeth. This is the story of one man, one mountain descent, and the moment he rolled, completely blind to what waited below, into the middle of a wolf pack that had already spread itself across the trail. If you have ever felt that specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature, stay with us. And if this is the kind of story that gets into your chest and stays there, consider subscribing right now, because there are more of them coming. The Carpathian Mountains of Romania hold some of the last genuinely wild country left on the European continent. They are not dramatic in the way of the Alps, not sheer and theatrical and postcard ready. They are something older and more patient. The forests here are dense beyond what the word usually suggests. These are not recreational woodlands with bicycle hire kiosks and picnic tables. These are places where the canopy closes so completely overhead that the forest floor exists in a permanent kind of dusk, even at midday in July. The undergrowth is tangled and thick and alive in ways that city-bred minds genuinely struggle to process. The trees have been growing here, largely unbothered, for centuries. In between them, move animals that have been here even longer. Romania has the largest population of gray wolves in continental Europe, outside of Russia. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 individuals roam the country's wild areas, concentrated heavily in the Carpathian Range. These are not wolves that have been reintroduced or managed or carefully monitored by wildlife programs. They have simply never left. While the rest of Europe spent the last several centuries methodically eliminating its apex predators, Romania held onto its wolves with a complicated mix of folklore, geography, and stubborn wildness. The Carpathians provided cover. The wolves provided themselves. A gray wolf in the Carpathians is not the same animal most people picture when they hear the word wolf. The mental image most people carry is assembled from fairy tales and horror films, a lean and sharp-edged silhouette against a full moon. The reality is considerably more substantial. A large male in this region can weigh close to 70 kilograms. Their paws leave impressions in mud that can span the width of a human hand with fingers spread. When they move through the forest, they do so with the particular quality of animals that have spent millions of years refining the art of not being seen. They are not clumsy, they do not crash through undergrowth, they flow. Wolves in the Carpathians live in family groups, packs structured around a dominant breeding pair with offspring of various ages filling out the ranks. Pack sizes here tend toward the larger end of the spectrum, somewhere between 6 and 12 animals on average, though packs of 15 or more have been documented. They are territorial in a way that is almost architectural, maintaining and defending home ranges that can span several hundred square kilometers, marked and remarked constantly, with scent deposits that communicate occupation, health, reproductive status, and warning to any other wolf that passes. Their communication system is sophisticated in ways that still actively surprise researchers. The howls that carry across mountain valleys are not random noise. They carry specific information about location, about the composition of the group, about mood and intention. In the summer months, wolves in this region follow prey. Red deer are the primary quarry, along with wild boar, roe deer, and occasional smaller animals when larger prey is scarce. A pack hunts as a coordinated unit, capable of covering enormous distances in a single night's movement. They can sustain a trot of around 10 kilometers per hour for hours without apparent effort. At full sprint, they can exceed 60 kilometers per hour for short bursts. When a hunt is active, the pack moves with a directed and urgent focus, the lead animal pushing the pace, the others flowing into the spaces behind and to the sides, the whole group operating as something that feels, when you watch it, less like a collection of individual animals and more like a single organism with distributed cognition. The wolves had been moving since before dawn on that particular morning. It was late summer, early August, and the hunting had been productive the night before. The pack, 11 animals in total, had brought down a young red deer in the lower part of their range, fed heavily, and then moved in the loose, unhurried way of animals that are not hungry, but also not entirely still. By mid-morning, they had traveled several kilometers upslope, following a shallow creek drainage that wound through the forest and eventually emerged onto a wider track, a forestry road of compacted gravel and packed earth that cut through the trees in a long, sweeping curve. The road descended steeply on one side and continued along the contour on the other. The wolves moved out onto the road surface, which was warm in the late summer sun after the cool dimness of the forest floor. The pack spread across the track in that loose and apparently casual way that wolves have when they are not hunting, the older animals pausing to investigate scent marks, the younger ones moving with a little more bounce and unpredictability, the whole group occupying perhaps 40 meters of road width and length between the first animal and the last. They were not anxious. There was no reason to be. The road through this section of forest saw almost no traffic. A forestry vehicle might come through once every few days. The wolves knew its rhythms the way they knew every feature of their territory, not through conscious catalog, but through the accumulated sensory memory of hundreds of passages. They were not alert in any heightened way. They were simply there, a family group taking the sun on a warm morning. The cyclist had started his descent approximately 2.5 kilometers up the road. His name is Andre, and he has been riding mountain bikes in the Carpathians for more than a decade. He grew up in a town at the mountain's edge and learned to ride on the loose tracks above it, first on a cheap hardtail that belonged to his older brother, and later on increasingly capable machines as he got better and more committed and more willing to put himself into terrain that most riders would walk. And by the time he was in his late 20s, he was doing things on a bicycle that required a fairly specific kind of comfort, with speed and consequence. And the Carpathian tracks above his home valley were as familiar to him as any landscape could be. He knew where the road surface changed character. He knew where drainage channels crossed the track and created small but significant bumps. He knew where the camber tilted inward on corners and where it tilted outward. He had ridden this particular descent dozens of times. What he did not know, what he could not know, was what was waiting around the long right-hand curve, approximately 2/3 of the way down. The descent begins in open terrain just below the tree line, a short exposed section where you can see the whole valley spread below and the road cutting down through the transition zone before it disappears into the forest. In that open section, the speed builds quickly. The surface is good there, compact and predictable, and the gradient is steep enough that you do not need to pedal. You simply settle into position and manage the speed with a combination of body weight and occasional brake input. Andre had done exactly this. He came off the ridgeline section at the kind of velocity that looks uncomfortable from the outside, but which feels, from inside it, like a completely reasonable and controlled state of affairs if you have spent enough years on a bicycle. He was somewhere above 60 kilometers per hour when he entered the forest. In the forest, the character of the descent changes. The trees close in on both sides and the light drops and the air cools, and the visual frame narrows to a moving corridor of brown and green, with the road surface directly ahead. The road also changes quality in the forest, not dramatically, but enough that the attentive rider adjusts. There are sections of slightly looser gravel over the harder base. There are places where tree roots have pushed up beneath the surface and created subtle undulations. Andre knew all of this. He was reading the road the way experienced riders do, not consciously analyzing each feature, but absorbing the whole surface into a continuous unconscious calculation that fed small adjustments into hands and feet and body position without the intervention of conscious thought. He was going fast, he was in control, he was entirely absorbed in the road surface and the vanishing point of the trail ahead. The curve is a long, sweeping right-hander that stays in the forest for its entire length. There is no sight line through it. The road disappears around the corner, and you ride on faith in what you know, which is that the road continues in the same character on the far side, and the surface does not suddenly disintegrate, and there is nothing across the trail. You ride on knowledge accumulated over dozens of passes. You ride on the reliable fact that this is a remote forestry track that sees almost nothing. He came around the corner at full speed. The wolves were approximately 20 meters ahead of him. The processing of that information, the full conscious recognition of what his eyes were receiving, took a moment that felt to Andre, afterward, like it had lasted a very long time. In reality, it was probably something in the range of a fraction of a second. His visual system registered a collection of large, pale gray and brown shapes spread across the road. His brain, running the initial pass of pattern recognition, produced a brief and entirely wrong interpretation of the scene. Logs. His brain said logs, forest debris across the track. He was already breaking hard on this initial wrong interpretation, because logs across the track are still an emergency regardless, and then the pattern recognition updated and the shapes resolved, and he understood that they were animals, large animals, and then the shapes moved and oriented toward him, and he understood that they were wolves. 11 wolves. He was still traveling at high speed. He had braked, but the physics of the situation meant that the gap was closing fast. He had perhaps 2 seconds, maybe slightly less, between recognition and arrival. What happened in the next few seconds is the part of this story that Andre has returned to many times in conversations with other riders and in his own thinking afterward, trying to understand what it was that he did and why he did it, and whether it was skill or instinct or something else entirely. The clinical answer is that he made a series of high-speed decisions under extreme stress that produced an outcome in which he did not collide directly with any of the animals and they did not make contact with him. The experiential answer is considerably messier and more interesting than that. The pack had distributed itself across roughly the full width of the usable road. There was no clean line through the middle. There was no obvious gap that a rider could aim for and thread. The wolves were not stationary. As Andre came around the corner and the bicycle entered their sensory world, a bicycle traveling at the kind of speed that delivers significant auditory and visual signal, the pack's response was immediate but not uniform. The reaction of a wolf to sudden, fast-moving, unexpected stimulus is not the same from every animal. In a pack, the responses are distributed. Some animals stood their ground, weight shifting forward, orientation locking onto the approaching machine. Some moved laterally, stepping off the road surface toward the tree line. The alpha female, a large and light-colored animal that Andre would later describe with somewhat unsteady precision as looking nearly white, moved toward the center of the road and stood fully square, facing directly at him. He went left. Not because left was obviously the better choice. Not because he had assessed the positions of all 11 animals and calculated optimal routing. He went left because there was a gap there, a partial gap, between the animals at the road edge and the animals toward the center, and his hands took him into that gap before the conscious part of his mind had finished forming the sentence that described the decision. The bicycle went left, the weight shifted, the tires tracked across the gravel, and he was suddenly inside the pack, inside the space between animals. The nearest wolf perhaps 2 meters to his right, another ahead and slightly left, others in peripheral vision that he was not able to process with any precision because there was no processing bandwidth available for peripheral information at that moment. He did not hit any of them. The wolves moved, not in panic, not in the chaotic scatter of animals that have been genuinely terrified, but in the coordinated readjustment of animals that are processing a fast-moving and ambiguous stimulus and repositioning accordingly. The gap opened as he entered it, and the bicycle went through, and the forest closed back in around the road ahead, and the wolves were behind him. He braked to a stop approximately 100 meters further down the trail. He sat on the bicycle with his feet on the ground and his hands still on the bars, and he did not move for some time. He told the story later to a friend, and the friend posted the account online, and it moved through the cycling and outdoor communities with the particular velocity that stories of this type tend to accumulate when they are both absolutely credible and absolutely extraordinary. The reaction was a combination of disbelief, intense engagement, and the specific quality of vicarious adrenaline that people experience when a story puts them into a physical situation at speed. People who had never been on a mountain bike in their lives read the account and felt their hands go slightly damp. People who had spent years on trails in wild country read it and recognized, in the most visceral possible way, the particular texture of the experience he was describing. But there is something beneath the immediate drama of the encounter that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it speaks to something larger about what wild places actually are, and what happens when two entirely different systems, the world of the wolf and the world of the cyclist, occupy the same space without warning. Wolves are not reliably dangerous to adult humans. This is a statement that requires some context, because the history of wolf and human interaction is long and complicated, and the folklore of it goes in a particular direction that the data does not entirely support. In Europe, documented fatal attacks by healthy wild wolves on adult humans are extraordinarily rare, almost to the point of statistical irrelevance. The animals that have historically come into fatal conflict with humans have most often been animals that were rabid, or animals that had become habituated to human presence and lost appropriate caution, or in situations of extreme scarcity where normal prey was absent and conditions were exceptional. A healthy, wild Carpathian wolf pack encountering a human in their territory will in the overwhelming majority of circumstances either avoid the encounter entirely by withdrawing before any contact is made, or, if surprised at close range, will retreat rapidly. They are not seeking conflict with something they do not recognize as prey. What makes Andre's encounter so uncommon is not that the wolves were present, because wolves are present in that landscape routinely, and their territories include those roads, but that the manner of the encounter stripped away the warning that would normally allow avoidance to happen. A wolf pack moving through its territory is running a continuous sensory survey of its environment. Sound, smell, visual movement, all of it is being processed constantly and automatically in a way that gives the animals time to make decisions about approach or avoidance before any encounter becomes close. A cyclist descending at high speed into a corner, with the wind coming down the slope away from the animals, with the sound of the approach masked by the noise of the forest and the geography of the curve, arrives without any of the precursor signals that the wolves would normally act on. The pack had no warning. Andre had no warning. Both parties were operating on the assumption that the road ahead was clear. What is remarkable, and what says something important about the nature of these animals, is the quality of the response when the warning collapsed and the encounter was suddenly immediate. The wolves did not attack. The wolves that held their ground did so in the posture of animals assessing a threat, not animals initiating one. The alpha female's movement to center road could be read as territorial display, as a statement of presence rather than intent. And then they moved aside. The pack that had spread itself across a road in the warm morning, the family group resting in the sun after a successful night, accommodated the hurtling impossible thing that came around the corner and let it through, and it was over. That accommodation, in the terrifying fraction of a second that it occupied, is worth thinking about. The Carpathian wolf is an animal that lives inside a set of rules that are ancient and mostly consistent. Those rules govern territory and hierarchy, and the management of prey, and the protection of pack members. They are not simple rules, but they are applied with a kind of thoroughness that comes from millions of years of refinement. One of those rules, deeply embedded and rarely overridden, is that the energetics of conflict must be favorable to make conflict worth entering. A wolf does not pick a fight that costs more than it gains. A cyclist arriving at 60 kilometers per hour, even if the wolves had no specific template for what a cyclist was, arrived as something large and fast and unpredictable in a way that made the calculation of conflict pointless. They moved. It was the right answer, arrived at without deliberation, because deliberation would have been too slow. Andre went back to that section of road the following week. He walked it this time, on foot, moving slowly through the forest and around the curve and standing in the place where the encounter had happened. He found wolf tracks in the softer ground at the road's edge where the gravel met the dirt of the verge. He found places where the gravel had been disturbed in patterns consistent with the rapid repositioning of large animals. He stood in the place where he had been and looked at the curve he had come around and tried to calculate the geometry of what had happened at speed. The gap he had ridden through was not large. In the cold assessment of daylight and stillness, it looked very small. He also found scat, marked territories. The wolves had been through the area again since the encounter. They had not abandoned their range because a bicycle had come through it at speed. They had continued to do exactly what they had always done, which was to move through their territory and feed and rest and maintain the boundaries of the life they had constructed in this piece of mountain forest. The road was not theirs, and it was not his. It ran through the middle of a world that belonged to older principles than either of them. There are more wolves using the Carpathian Mountain Road network than most people who use those roads are aware of. Camera trap data collected by wildlife researchers working in the region shows regular wolf crossings of forest roads throughout the year. The animals cross at night most frequently, but daytime crossings are not rare, particularly in less visited sections, where traffic is minimal and the animals have learned that the disruption risk is low. What Andre encountered was not an exceptional circumstance, in the sense of the wolves doing something they do not normally do. They were on a road in their territory, because that road offered easy movement through terrain, and they had no reason to expect that anything would come around that corner at that speed. The exceptional circumstance was entirely in the meeting of two things that should not have met at that speed and that distance, and in the physics and the luck and the trained reflexes and the ancient wolf wisdom that together produced an outcome in which everyone walked away. Mountain biking as a discipline involves a particular relationship with consequence. The sport requires the practitioner to accept that moving fast through terrain that is not designed for speed and not engineered for safety means accepting a constant low-level proximity to things going wrong. Every rider who takes a technical trail at real speed is making a calculation, usually unconscious, that the probability and severity of things going wrong is acceptable given the experience of going right. That calculation is usually made against a backdrop of known variables. The surface type and quality, the gradient, the presence of other trail users, the weather and light conditions, what falls outside the calculation, what cannot be included because it is not a thing that experience has trained you to anticipate, is the thing that surprises you. A pack of 11 wolves spread across a forestry road at mid-morning in August is not a variable that the standard risk calculation includes. Andre has not stopped riding. He is very clear about this when people ask, because they do ask. He rides the same trails. He rides with more attention to the corners he cannot see through, which is a reasonable adjustment. He has developed, he says, a somewhat different relationship with the experience of entering a curve blind, one that is tinged with a quality that was not there before. Not fear exactly, something more complex than fear. A kind of awareness, perhaps, of the fact that the trail does not empty itself ahead of you as a courtesy. The trail is continuous with the world around it. The world around it is occupied. The natural world in general has a relationship with surprise that is entirely unlike the human relationship with it. Wild animals do not experience surprise in the way that humans do, with the cascading cognitive and emotional aftereffects that continue to reshape behavior and memory for days or years afterward. For the wolves, the encounter with Andre was a stimulus that required a response, and they produced the response, and then it was over. They moved on. They fed. They maintained their territory. The encounter did not, as far as any external observer could determine, alter their use of that road or that area of their range. The sensory world of a wolf is so constantly full of stimulus that requires processing, that requires real-time decision-making against a backdrop of continuous environmental flux, that a single alarming event does not occupy the same cognitive real estate in a wolf's experience that it occupies in a human's. For Andre, it has been rather different. He has told the story many times now, and the telling of it has not diminished the texture of the memory. The moment of recognition, the gap, the white wolf standing center road, the bicycle going through, and the forest closing back in ahead. These are images that have remained vivid and immediate, in a way that strong experiences often do, held just below the surface of normal consciousness, and ready to surface at the slightest prompt. The smell of mountain forest, the particular quality of light through dense spruce, the sound of gravel under bicycle tires. Each of these can pull the memory forward with a clarity that his ordinary days do not carry. He has become, in the time since the encounter, more attentive to the wolf question in the Carpathians generally. He has read about the population, about the distribution of packs across the range, about the ongoing tension between conservation interests and the livestock farming communities that operate at the mountain's edge and bear a disproportionate share of the cost of coexisting with large predators. He has learned that the wolves in the Carpathians are not uniformly protected, that they occupy a complicated legal space in which hunting quotas exist and are contested, and the status of individual packs can shift depending on politics and local pressure. He has found himself, with a directness that still slightly surprises him, invested in the continuation of those wolves. Not in an abstract sense, in the particular sense of caring about the specific animals he encountered on that specific road, the alpha female with her pale coat standing square in the morning sun, the others moving in the patient and unhurried way of animals that own the ground they stand on. The wolves do not know this. They do not require it. They are getting on with the entirely sufficient project of being wolves in the Carpathians, which is a project that has been running, without meaningful interruption, for a very long time. The story of this encounter is also the story of something that is happening in a number of places across Europe with a quiet and important consistency. Large predators, specifically wolves and brown bears in the Carpathian context, are maintaining or in some cases expanding viable populations in landscapes that have been claimed by human activity in various ways. The road through the forest where Andrei descended is a human artifact, a product of the forestry industry and the infrastructure built to support it. The wolves use it as a movement corridor because it offers easy walking, and they are pragmatic about efficiency, but the road's existence does not define the landscape for them in the way that it defines it for the humans who built and use it. For the wolves, the road is simply a feature of the terrain, useful in some ways, associated with occasional risk in others, incorporated into the mental map of the territory without any particular emphasis. This overlapping of human-built infrastructure with wild animal territory is not a niche phenomenon in the Carpathians. It is the baseline condition of that landscape. The forests are logged and managed and traversed by roads and tracks built for those purposes, and they are also home to wolves and bears and lynx and red deer and wild boar and all the other components of a functioning large mammal ecosystem, in numbers that would be startling to someone who had formed their ideas about Europe's wildlife based on, say, a drive through the lowlands of central France. The coexistence is not comfortable in all its dimensions, and it is not without cost, primarily to the farming communities that lose livestock to predators and carry that loss as a direct economic and sometimes emotional burden. But it exists. The wolves are there, the road runs through their territory. Sometimes a cyclist comes around a corner at speed. The Carpathian Mountains span multiple countries, and within Romania specifically, the largest continuous forested areas are found in Transylvania, a word that carries its own freight of imagery in most people's minds. Imagery almost entirely constructed from literary sources that have almost nothing to do with the actual character of the place. Transylvania is a high forested plateau surrounded by mountain ranges. Its forests are among the oldest and least disturbed in Europe. The wolves that Andrei encountered are likely members of a pack whose range extends across thousands of hectares of this forest, a range maintained through constant movement and marking and the management of a complex social structure. Their prey base is healthy, the deer and boar populations are robust, the hunting is productive. In other words, the wolves that came around that corner into Andrei's life were animals in good condition, operating in a landscape that was still, fundamentally, theirs. This is not the story of a marginal population clinging to existence in a landscape that has largely expelled them. This is the story of animals that are present in force, in the place they have always been, doing what they have always done. The question of what Andrei should have done differently is one that people who discuss the encounter tend to return to. From a pure risk management perspective, the answer involves things like appropriate speed management for blind corners in areas of known wildlife activity. This is technically correct and also slightly beside the point, in the way that technically correct answers often are when applied retroactively to events that did not go wrong. He was going fast. Fast is the point of the descent. The descent is beautiful, and the speed is exhilarating, and the hundreds of times he had done it before had produced no wolves, and so the probability calculation he was running did not include wolves, because no calculation includes the thing that has never happened before. After the encounter, the calculation changed. Not toward paralysis or toward the abandonment of speed, but toward a more complete picture of what the terrain actually contained. The forest, the road through it, the corners that cannot be seen around, all of these mean something different now, not worse necessarily, but more complete. The world the road runs through got fuller. It was always full, of course. The wolves were always there, using the road, moving through the territory, maintaining the life of the pack through the ordinary, extraordinary processes of hunting and feeding and reproduction and the raising of young. Andrei just did not know they were there until he was inside their family group at 60 kilometers per hour. There is something in this that reaches beyond the specific drama of the encounter. The wild world is not performing for the people who move through it. The wolves on that road in the August morning were not positioned there for effect. They were not a backdrop to Andrei's adventure. They were engaged in their own project, which had nothing to do with him, and which had been underway long before he reached the corner, and which continued without any particular reorganization after he passed through. The forest does not clear itself for the cyclist. The territory does not empty itself for the hiker. The river does not slow for the swimmer. The wild world proceeds according to its own principles, and the humans who enter it are guests in a space that has a prior and continuing occupancy. The Carpathian wolf has been sharing this landscape with humans for thousands of years. The relationship has not always been easy. There are centuries of history in which the wolf was actively persecuted across Europe, driven out of landscape after landscape by a combination of hunting, habitat loss, and the deep cultural antagonism encoded in the stories that human communities told about them. The fairy tales were not neutral. They were propaganda of a particular type, reinforcing the framing of the wolf as threat and enemy and thing to be eliminated, and they were remarkably effective. By the 20th century, the wolf had been extirpated from most of Western Europe. The French wolf was gone. The German wolf was gone. The Scandinavian wolf was nearly gone. The British wolf had been gone for several centuries. And yet the Carpathian wolf endured. It endured because the Carpathians are large and complex and kept their wildness in ways that the managed landscapes of Western Europe did not. It endured because the human communities of the mountain region, despite the real conflicts with livestock predation, never fully resolved on the total elimination of the animal in the way that communities elsewhere did. It endured because wolves are deeply capable of endurance, capable of surviving at low densities under pressure, and then recovering when the pressure reduces. The Romanian wolf population today is a remnant that became a recovery, a population that survived the worst that a hostile century could produce and emerged on the other side still functioning, still wild, still spread across the mountain range in family groups that maintain their territories with the same focused attention to the same ancient principles that have governed wolf life since long before there were roads to rest on in the morning sun. When Andrei came around that corner, he was entering the edge of something that is genuinely rare in the contemporary European landscape. Not rare like an individual animal sighting that you get lucky to witness and then the animal is gone. Rare in the structural sense. A functioning large predator ecosystem, operating in its own terms, in a landscape large enough and wild enough to sustain it. The wolf pack on that road was not a curiosity or an exception. It was the top of a food web that shapes the character of everything below it. The deer that move through the forest do so under the pressure that those wolves create, and the movement of the deer shapes the vegetation, and the vegetation shapes everything else. The wolves are not ornamental to that ecosystem. They are load-bearing. Remove them, and the forest changes. This is not a theoretical claim. The research done in Yellowstone after wolf reintroduction demonstrated with remarkable clarity the cascading effects that apex predators create in their ecosystems, effects that run all the way down through the food web to the vegetation patterns and even the behavior of rivers. The Yellowstone wolves changed where the deer grazed and how long they stayed in any given location, and this changed the vegetation along riverbanks, and the changed vegetation stabilized the banks, and the stabilized banks changed how the rivers ran. The presence of wolves changes the world they live in at every scale simultaneously. The wolves of the Carpathians have been making those changes in that forest continuously for a very long time. The forest that Andrei descends through is partly a product of those wolves, shaped by the pressure they exert on the deer, which shapes the understory, which shapes the canopy, which shapes the drainage, which shapes the road surface, that Andrei's tires read at high speed on the descent. The wolves built part of the world he was riding through. He came around the corner and found them there. In the days and weeks after the encounter, Andrei returned to that road multiple times. He was drawn back to it with a quality of attention that he has not entirely been able to explain, even to himself. Partly it was the ordinary human need to revisit the site of an intense experience, to stand in the place where something happened and let the memory and the present location overlay each other and produce something that approaches understanding. Partly it was simpler than that. He wanted to see them again. He did not see them again in any close sense, but he found their signs. Fresh tracks in the mud beside the creek that ran along the lower edge of the road, scat in the forest near the curve, marked prominently in the way of animals communicating occupancy. On one evening visit, moving quietly along the road as the light was failing, he heard howling from high on the slope above him, a long rising note that opened up into a chorus, as other voices joined it, carrying across the valley in the way that wolf howls do, filling the space with sound that you feel, rather than just hear, that lands in the chest and produces a response that has nothing to do with rational thought. He stood very still and listened until the sound faded. The mountain was quiet again, and the light was almost gone, and the forest was closed and dark on both sides of the road. He walked back to where his bicycle was leaning against a tree, and he rode down the rest of the descent in the last of the light, slower than he would normally go, the tires steady on the gravel, the curve coming and going smoothly, nothing in the road ahead except the road ahead. The wolves were somewhere up the slope, invisible, present, continuing. This is the nature of wild country. It is not waiting for you. It is not arranged around your presence. It is busy with its own processes, its own hierarchies and hungers and urgencies, and it permits your passage through it without adjusting itself to your comfort or your expectations. The mountain does not flatten itself for the cyclist. The river does not slow for the swimmer. The forest does not empty itself of wolves, because a man on a bicycle needs a clear road. The world that Andre entered when he swung down off the ridgeline onto the descent that August morning was complete before he arrived, and it was complete after he passed through. The encounter with the wolf pack was not the world performing for him. It was the world going about its business and including him, briefly and at speed, in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of its continuation. 11 wolves in a Carpathian forest road. Late summer morning. A man on a bicycle coming around a corner at 60 kilometers per hour. The gap opened. He went through. The forest closed in ahead. And the wolves, somewhere behind him, turned their attention back to the morning, to the sun on the gravel, to the complex and ongoing project of being a wolf pack in a mountain range that is still, against considerable odds, wild enough to hold them. That fact, the bare continuing fact of their presence in that landscape, doing what they have always done in the territory they have always occupied, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about this story. Not the speed, not the proximity, not the physics of the near miss. Those things are extraordinary in themselves, and they are the things that make the blood move when you read about them. But underneath all of that, quieter and more durable, is the fact that the wolves were there at all. That the Carpathian forest is large enough and wild enough and still intact enough to hold a viable, functioning wolf population in the 21st century, when most of the continent has lost these animals and the landscapes they shaped. That when a cyclist comes around a corner blind on a remote forestry road in the mountains of Romania, there is still, genuinely still, the possibility that he will find the world exactly as it was before he was part of it, occupied and operating and complete. The wolves in the road, the sun warm on their backs, the forest around them ancient and patient, and entirely indifferent to the fact that anything as recent as a bicycle was ever invented. He came around the corner and found the wild world waiting, not for him, just waiting, just there, just continuing, as it has been continuing for longer than anyone alive can fully imagine. And the wolves moved aside, and he went through, and the road kept going,